Thank you very much. So, welcome to the panel. I would like to make a quick introduction round that you know who is in front of you. My name is Nina Siedler. I'm a Berlin-based lawyer in the blockchain space since 2015. Was one of the founding members of the German Blockchain Association back in 2017 and have been in the space since then. And I would actually, ladies first, like to invite Florence to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Nina. So, hi, everybody. My name is Florence. I worked as an attorney in the field of privacy and data protection for 12 years. And then I was a group privacy counsel for the Ferrero Group, which you might know because of Nutella, Kinder, and all those delicious chocolate. And then recently, I completely changed my path and stumbled upon the Web3 project, and I joined the Polkadot community as a legal counsel, obviously still very oriented around privacy and data protection on the blockchain.
Thank you. And Samuel, you actually had the longest way to get here, and I'm really, really happy that you made your way. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Samuel Cloutier. I'm from the Cayman Islands, where I sit as an independent director on boards of crypto companies. Previously, I worked for the Cayman Islands government as a senior policy advisor for 7 years. I led the development of about 20+ pieces of legislation in Cayman, including the regulatory law for crypto over there. So I became the subject matter expert for the government. Most speeches, most legislation, actually most of the legislations would go through me. So I have an insider view on how policy is developed. And since I left, I've been taking the stage and just speaking out about what I've seen and the trends that we're seeing.
And that's actually what we want to talk about today. We would like to talk about the regulation that we are seeing, specifically touching upon privacy topics, but from a different angle. Typically, it is the anti-money laundering rules that dig deep into the privacy sphere of everyone, plus the tax transparency and data sharing rules that had been basically created by the OECD and is now being seen implemented all across the globe. And so, Samuel, maybe you can share a little bit of your insights. How are we getting all these global standards?
Yeah, so we all know the story, right? We talk to somebody who's up for election, we vote for them, our hopes are really high, and then they get into power, and then the things that we didn't expect would happen. So there's more surveillance, more compliance, more anti-money laundering requirements that are being put in place. So while I was working for the government, essentially, I noticed one trend that really alarmed me. And that's the centralization of policy development. So policy is basically when a society has an issue or problem that they want to solve. Somebody like me would write a policy paper suggesting how to fix it, right? And that usually ends up in new laws or new regulations. So that's the policy development process. And what I noticed was that Cayman, as an independent jurisdiction, right, we're a British overseas territory, but we still have we're supposed to have some degree of independence. What actually happened was that the policy, the things that we had to do and how we had to do them, actually didn't come from the government. It didn't come from people like me. It came from global standard-setting bodies. So what that does, essentially, for policy to be good, for laws to work, there has to be a policy cycle, right? A law is put in place. Is it good? Is it effective? Yes or no? If no, let's change it. That's the policy cycle as it should be. But the way it is now, policy is being developed, for example, by the FATF or another global standard-setting body. So your elected representative, if you go to him or her and you say, well, I have an issue with this, I think we should change something, they can't make that change anymore. They then have to go to Paris, or they have to go to Luxembourg, they have to go wherever that global standard-setting body meets, and then discuss with all the other countries that are part of that association. So that basically removes policymaking and accountability from the policymakers and the people who are impacted by the policy. So that's what actually happened, and that's what I saw. When I was looking at doing definitions for a regulatory framework, essentially I couldn't deviate from the global standard. If I deviated, even by a little dot or comma or word, I had to justify that, and that's a long and thorough process. So I saw that, and it really alarmed me, because I think that once policymaking is removed from the people who are actually impacted by the laws, when there's no more accountability, then policy tends to just happen on its own. And another thing that I just really want to quickly say here, why are these surveillance kind of laws and regulations being put in place? I don't actually subscribe to the, cabal working in some secret shadow somewhere. What I see and what I saw from working from the government is that you don't see what the government sees or what the supervisor sees. The supervisor sees rape cases, murders, child pornography. They see all of the negative things happening in a society, right? And their job is to prevent that or stop that. So they don't see everything that we do here. When we transact and we're improving society with our apps, they don't necessarily see that. They only see the negative. So what feedback are they giving policymakers? Well, we just saw a child being abused. We saw a murder. They used crypto, to get paid. We have to do something about it. So it's an organic process that just ends up adding more requirements, more regulation, and more powers to government, because I think they don't necessarily see the good things that we're doing.
Yeah, that's the fact that all these regulations are basically built in silos. And the problem is that these international organizations that you mentioned, the FATF, for example, is actually nothing else but a standing conference of the OECD, right? So it's not the legislative power that is sitting there, but it's basically the supervisory authority and the executives. They send their representatives there to write their own rules. And that's also part of the problem. And Florence, I think you have a good example where this is leading to.
Yes, so as I told you, I have this privacy data protection background. I'm also teaching actually the enforcement of European data protection law at university. And one of the examples I usually give my student in a clash between, on the one side, anti-money laundering and anti-terrorism regulation, and on the other side, the protection of the right to privacy comes up to this case. I was working as an attorney for an international law firm, and one day the partner from the funds department calls me and says, Flo, we have an emergency situation right here. One of our clients, who is an ultimate beneficial owner here for several funds in Luxembourg, just got his private address published in the public register for UBOs. So this is a legal obligation for a few years now, as you may know. We have AML KYC regulation at the EU level that were transposed at national level, and most member states in the EU have to publish the names, birth date, and address of ultimate beneficial owners. The issue is that instead of publishing their professional address in Mexico, because this client was obviously a very wealthy man based in Mexico, instead of publishing his professional address, they published their private residence address. And this man had a spouse and 2 kids. And back then in Mexico, kids were being kidnapped on a daily basis by gangs that were then asking for a ransom. And as soon, obviously, as you could target a wealthy individual, and if their address was made publicly available, your entire family security and physical integrity was in danger. We deployed the full force of the law, including the General Data Protection Regulation, so a regulation that is supposed to protect your right to privacy and to data protection against abuses, either by the public or the private sector. I contacted the Data Protection Authority. I explained to them why the publication of this address was a mistake, the fact that it could be switched to something more proportionate, like professional address. Hence, we achieved the legitimate objective of the AML KYC regulation, which is transparency, and yet we protect the physical integrity of that family. Within 6 hours, the address was taken down and the professional address was published in the register. So this is like a good case where things actually kind of worked after a mistake was made. But I'm not naive. The only reason why the right to privacy of this family was enforced so quickly and efficiently is because they had 12 lawyers working for them, and this family could afford us. And this is usually not the case of a lot of people who are confronted almost on a daily basis with infringements of their right to privacy in completely other sectors than the financial sectors.
Yeah, and I mean, in light of the current wave of kidnappings in France, I think this again highlights that urgency. I'm not sure if you're aware, but the numbers are so extremely high in France because there had been an official from the finance administration actually selling a list of the top crypto holders in France. And now the organized crime is working down that list. And also there had been a KYC provider who had been hacked. So basically what we are seeing is all this data collection is creating data honeypots, and there is no such thing than, you know, unhacked or unhackable databases, ultimately. Yeah, so what is the way?
What's the cost to society of compliance? Because I think we should really kind of raise that up. You know, we all have these requirements. We have to do KYC, and compliance nowadays is more of a religion than it is anything else, right? Is it really catching criminals? I don't know. The data that we have, the very little data that we have, says that it kind of isn't. It's catching about 1.1% criminal proceeds. So I think you had some interesting stats on the cost to society.
That's right. I found data for the UK, and not many countries are making these public, but the estimated cost of AML compliance alone, and I'm really talking only about the anti-money laundering compliance cost of the financial services industry, not everything else, not DORA and all the other compliance topics, were estimated to be roughly the half of the national defense budget of the UK. I mean, that is insane as such. And 50% higher than the police budget, the annual police budget. And I mean, yeah, you might say, well, that's the rich banks paying these costs, but that's nonsense, right? It's us as a society that bear those costs. And if you look at the budget split in total, you would never, you know, put like such a high amount just on AML compliance costs instead of actually chasing the criminals and preventing crime firsthand, right?
And just to add to that as well, I mean, and these stats are very nebulous, so don't quote me on this, but I think in the EU I read there's $86 billion being spent on compliance, right? And we pay that. So when we do transactions, we pay that cost. It's not the banks paying it. And 86 billion on compliance. And then I asked a question. I said, well, how much is being spent by law enforcement on trying to actually catch criminals, right? Financial crime, I mean. I think it's 8 billion. So there's $8 billion of capital being put towards actually stopping financial criminals, and there's $86 billion being spent on this compliance infrastructure. What would happen if we flip those numbers around? Right? Would we catch more criminals? I don't know, maybe. Right? So we have to shift our focus, and money laundering is a post-crime crime. When somebody launders money and does the integration and all those things, the crime already happened, right? So we're not focused on stopping the crime, we're focused on the post-crime.
Yeah, on data collection, right? Which then is not really used. I don't really have the numbers now at hand, but the number of money that you actually find and freeze due to this data collection is also minimal, right? So the effectiveness is not there at all. And I think everybody working in compliance will agree to that statement. So ultimately, we need to do something about it.
To add on this, so that's what I usually refer to as compliance on paper versus compliance in practice. And a lot of the legislation that have been adopted recently, be it in the AML KYC world or other sectors, that force people or companies rather to do a lot of record keeping and information gathering to reach compliance are extremely costly. So that's what we just discussed, the cost of compliance. But it's also very ineffective in the sense that it's compliance on paper. People are filling in checklists. But you're not really catching criminals. You're not really preventing harm from being done to society. You're not preventing abuses. So we have to be a bit smarter about sometimes the way we draft legislation, and then we question and challenge whether they are being effective or not. And it's true that sometimes, I mean, the issue can basically arise at different level. When the legislation is drafted, poor debates, poor text, And then when it is enforced, lack basically of resources for proper enforcement, and sometimes also lack of prevention.
Yeah, and so this, I think, from my insider view working, in the policy department, I think most people around me understood this at a guttural level, but they were so focused on trying to stop these people from abusing children or selling drugs or committing crimes, and no other options were given. Right? So what do? You just use the easiest thing. There's a global standard. It says that we have to put a very burdensome compliance infrastructure, but it's the only option that's presented. And so everybody just flocks to that. And it's very difficult to question. So I had to do the regulatory framework. I had to put measures in place that implemented the anti-money laundering, that gave powers to the government and the supervisor to look into accounts, to seize. I implemented legislation that applied to sanctions. And one thing that I noticed is that although due process is followed, anti-money laundering really skirts due process. So I don't know how many people here have had money frozen at a bank account, just to show of hands. Right? So okay, so just a few. Well, fair enough. Maybe Europe is better than North America. But every time I wire money from the Cayman Islands, there's a certain reputation there, which is totally unjustified, by the way. We're an incredibly transparent jurisdiction. But just because of that stigma, my money gets frozen when I send it. Right? So when you look at due process, am I under suspicion? Is there suspicion against me? Is that why my wires are being held? No. It's a preventative measure. Right? So in my mind, due process isn't followed. You're supposed to only be able to hold money and freeze money if you're under suspicion, right? So anti-money laundering skirts due process, and our ancestors fought for us to have that due process in place. And I think it's our duty to make sure that due process continues to be applied and that our rights are protected.
So basically, how did we get there, right? So the start of this was basically chasing the drug dealers in the US, and the idea was follow the money. That was the doctrine. And in order to get that done, they thought it would be a good idea to put KYC in front of the accounts, right? So only KYC people are permitted to enter the financial system. Nowadays, a big problem in the fight against financial crime is the so-called money mules, right? So people actually do the KYC and then pass on the control of that KYC account to the criminals. Sometimes not even knowingly, right? So sometimes people do this in the streets, they are poor, they get $20 for making a little video and they didn't even notice that they opened a bank account. And this problem cannot be solved with more KYC, right? Nowadays, we already have, like when you wave in the camera, the cameras are so good, your fingerprint can be isolated from that. The iris scan is supposedly safe, but not any longer, I think, with AI in place. So how are we going to prove that we are a human and what human we are in the future, right? So I think this idea of sheltering the financial system of criminals by KYCing everybody is about to fail anyway, right? So we need to come up with other solutions.
And I want to just tie in that the solution isn't better identification, because that's a dangerous slope to slide down. I think the solution is to follow due process and give money to law enforcement so they can actually catch and investigate criminals. They're woefully underfunded right now, all over the world. Right? My country, in Europe, in North America. So all this money being put in compliance should really go to the people who are actually investigating, in my opinion. And I think that's the way to fix it, not to start scanning irises like WorldCoin.
Florence, do you have another proposal how we could proceed and protect the overall society?
I agree with you, better enforcement, that's a big thing. But also better trust in our enforcement forces. So I'm not a big fan of the police. quite weirdly, every time I walk in the street, if I cross some policemen, I have more this chilling effect than, oh, I feel so protected because representative of the executive force are on the streets to protect me. I think that a lot of public institutions are underfunded, which leads sometimes to very patchy ways to enforce the laws and protect the people that are supposed to be protected by them. So better budgeting, prevention, and enforcement. And also, obviously, keeping our legislator and politician accountable and calling bullshit when we see it. And we were discussing an example a bit earlier that is actually not at all relating to AML KYC. So let's leave the financial world for a moment and talk about something that concerns us all, which is chat messaging. So you may be using Signal or Element or WhatsApp or Messenger. We are all communicating through those interfaces nowadays. And a few years back, in the EU, there was a proposal for a new regulation that was labeled as child protection regulation that would basically force internet service providers of those chat messaging apps to monitor all our conversation, to make sure that material of sexual abuses or sexual violence against children could be detected, prevented, and then the information could be transmitted to the authorities so that those people could be arrested. Obviously, a very legitimate aim, right? As you might know, there is this concept in EU law when different rights and interests are clashing. So, for example, on the one side, you have the right to children protection, which is a human right. On the other side, you have the right to privacy. Typically, with that type of regulation, those two rights are clashing. We want to protect the children, but we want to make sure also that the state doesn't have an easy way to survey all our conversation all the time. When courts or even the legislator has to decide to establish a balance between those conflicting rights, usually you have a three-step test. The first one is the measure legitimate? Is the objective we're trying to pursue legitimate? Here you can see child protection, very legitimate objective. Okay, we pass the test. Second question is this measure necessary to protect children in this case? Here you can start already arguing. Is really surveying all our chat messages necessary to prevent child abuses? Wouldn't we be able to achieve that in other ways? Which links to the third step of the test, which is proportionality. Is surveying all chat messages proportionate to the aim of protecting children against sexual violence? And this is where we really have to step back and look at the situation, like effectively. You might know that if we look at statistics, only 3%, more or less, of sexual abuse cases get reported to the authorities. Within those 3%, only 1% reach the court, and within that 1%, even less criminals get a judgment that actually leads to consequences. So current enforcement, with the cases that already exist and are piling up on the desk of prosecutors, is already extremely poor. What are they going to do with hundreds of millions of messages that they would monitor and detect? The pile is just going to get higher, but enforcement is going to remain poor, if not terrible. And this is where you can see the hypocrisy and say, in this case, this regulation or the measure they're trying to implement will definitely not be proportionate and will probably lead to even a worse result.
And always be careful when you hear we are doing this to protect children. There is typically another motivation behind it, and we have another case currently, that is the age control for social media. Having kids on my own, I agree, social media as it is built right now is really a dangerous thing. However, I believe the true motivation behind this age control is that, you know, the large companies earning their money with ads, they want to be able to distinguish whether they are talking to a human or to a bot, right? Because nobody is paying ads when you're just bots in front of you. So I think that is the true motivation behind this age verification discussion that we are currently having. It's not really child protection.
I don't know, Nina. I think if the government knows what I had for supper last night, I think less children will be, abused. The thing is we have to target. So we're talking about problems, but we have to know who to target and who to talk to, right? Our instinct is to go to our elected officials. Right? Well, I'm going to complain. I'm going to send a letter. And that might be effective to some degree. But then the elected officials, like I said at the beginning, will have to go to their policy development teams, who will then have to go to a global standard setting meeting, who will then have to compete with 40 other jurisdictions as to how to change or to put something on the agenda. It's an extremely complicated process. So who should we target, right? We need to see who's actually setting policy. And I'm sorry, but for most of the fundamental requirements that we're supposed to comply with, it's not done at the state level, even in the EU. So the EU has a voice. When it goes to the FATF plenary, there's a number of EU jurisdictions. I think Germany, France, et cetera, a few more. So out of 40, they might have 5 or 6 votes, right? And that's how the process works. We need to target the FATF. We need to target where policy is actually being developed. And we don't have data, and neither do they to a certain extent. If you want to see data on how money laundering requirements are being applied and effective, there's a thing called a mutual evaluation report. You can search that for any country. Mutual evaluation report, Italy, Germany, wherever. And you'll have all the data, how many types of entities, how could they be misused. So all of that assessment's being done. But effectiveness for the FATF is how well are you implementing the standards. It's not necessarily how many crimes are you preventing, right? That's the stated goal, but there's a kind of a blurring of the lines there. So we need to target global standard setting bodies because that's where real decisions are made, and they have to be held accountable.
That is a good point. And I would like to use the opportunity to also point towards the UN Cybercrime Convention. If you have never heard about that, look it up. Look how that convention was actually put in place. It was drafted by Russia and with the support of China and Syria and alike pushed through the General Assembly on the 24th December 2024. And had not been on the agenda 2 days before. Yeah, guess what? Who was not there at Christmas Eve? Well, the whole West, right? And now we are having this instrument there, which will become enforceable once that 40 countries signed up to it. And if you count how many democratic states we have out there, I have problems counting more than 40. The United Nations is having 197 members. So these tools that initially the West built up on a global scale are now weaponized basically against us. And, I think that is also something to keep in mind when it comes to data sharing, like anti-money laundering rules. They require you to send your identification data along with any transaction across the border, no matter where. And when you then talk to the cybercrime units here of the police, they are openly saying this is like society's suicide, what we are doing here. So, yeah.
Should we end on a good note? We have 6 minutes left. Or should we just depress everybody in the room? Depress? Well, I don't know. If we want to go with some solutions now, we have about 6 minutes left, right? We all know the problems. We all instinctively know what's going on. We know where it can go. We're one bad government from being elected away from, a totalitarian state. And imagine if Stalin had the tools that are in place today to monitor and supervise and surveil the population. Just imagine what a bad government could do, right? The people putting this in place don't want to surveil, and they don't want to control, and they don't want to know what I had for supper last night. That's not the point. But the tools that are being built are there, and if or when that ever happens, things can get pretty ugly. So do you have any solutions that you'd like to present?
We need more people to raise their voices, right? This is not talked about enough. You don't see this in an everyday newspaper, these discussions. So that's one invitation to everyone out there, start talking about these things and not let them be in the silent space any longer, because it's just getting worse. We talked about this before, there are great technical privacy-enhancing solutions out there, but be cautious, right? Politicians and law enforcement, they don't like them, and if we are not cautious, those will be prohibited at one point in time, right? So we need to start finally defending our privacy space.
I'm a big optimist. I've always been, and I remember when the GDPR, so the General Data Protection Regulation, was adopted in the EU. I thought it was a beautiful regulation. I was in love with it. I was like, this is great. I'm going to help companies to respect the right of privacy of so many people in so many sectors. And then obviously down the line, it was like, okay, curb your enthusiasm, because it's not working as smoothly as I hope so. But down the line, I also saw amazing people really doing something great with it. And actually, our next speaker, Max Schrems Association, is a brilliant example of how when people get together and decide to fight for a right cause, you can move mountains with very little. He's doing a lot of strategic litigation, and he's going to talk about it right after us. And then a second solution, which obviously I discussed a lot those last days because of the Web3 Summit, was indeed privacy by default in the technology. To not let bad legislation, poor enforcement, prevent us from still protecting our rights when we feel like we are against the wall here. And so this could be an option, technology, and obviously this could also be a counterbalancing forces against abuse of powers.
Yeah.
That's the optimism, and somebody wanted doom and gloom over there, so I'm going to give it to them. Essentially, what I saw, right, was a gradual, slow boiling cooking process that was meant to incorporate crypto into the TradFi and the compliance. And the next targets are unhosted wallets, so hardware wallets. That's the next target. That's what's being discussed at the FATF level. What do you think they're going to do? You're going to just let us use it whenever we want to? No, they're going to start certifying them, right? Like self-hosted apps, wallet apps, right? They're going to have to be certified. The EU asked this in a recent consultation, should CASPs, which is the regulated entities, should they only be allowed to use certified DeFi, right? So those questions are being asked. And it's not just unhosted wallets, DeFi, smart contracts, who's holding the admin keys? Oh, it's on GitHub. Well, who's contributing to the GitHub, right? Is it one or two people? Then those people control the smart contract, right, and the code. So regulators are taking a step. They're really digging down now, and they understand. They might not have understood crypto a while ago, but now they do. And so those questions are being discussed. And more doom and gloom will come our way if we don't stand up. And if people think they can just vote every 4 years and things will fix themselves, I got news for you. It's not. It hasn't really worked, and it's not going to work. And part of a democracy, a necessary part of a democracy, is an active population. We have to be active. You have tools right now to keep your government accountable. I have a hat here, open source the state. You can kind of do that with freedom of information requests. You want to know why something got put in place? Send a freedom of information request. It doesn't cost anything, and it shouldn't cost anything. If it does, it won't be much, right? And even if you get denied, that's okay. Work with it, tweak it, send another one in. We can keep our governments accountable, and we have to, or else we lose this beautiful freedom that we've benefited from. So.
And I can only support what you had said. Like Max, the next speaker, is like part of the solution with his strategic lawsuits. In a democracy, we have 3 powers, and we used to under-leverage our third power, and that is the courts, right? So the European Court of Justice invalidated data sharing agreements already more than once. And we need to step up and bring these cases in front of the courts, right? So I think, yeah, active citizenship. That's what we need to call for.
We have time for like one question. We got 30 seconds. Somebody real quick, shout out a question if you have one. Nope. I think we've depressed everyone.
But also, if people do have questions and you're staying around for a bit longer, you can answer a few questions outside. Then
Sure.
let's have applause for you first.
Thank you.